If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to the 12th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. This is where we'll be spending our time. One of the aspects of, and we're thinking about Mother's Day today, but I would say this for all of us, but especially moms. They are wearied, I think, by a lot of the things that they have to go through just to make sure that when we were growing up that our needs were met. It's not an easy thing. I remember reading this article about somebody who looked at their mom's hands, and they could see in their mom's hands just the wear of all those decades of dealing with raising children. And all of us in this room are a product of a mom. Somewhere a mom took care of every one of us. I think it's appropriate to think about that. But that ties in also with the fact that we talked about it a little bit in Sunday school this morning. We're spent, all of us. You know the most literal thing you can say is I'm spending time. Because it goes away. We don't get time back. Somebody says, well, I'm going to save some time. No, we're not. We don't save any time. The time just continues to pass. We don't save 1 second. Time goes, and it never comes back. So when we spend it, that is one of the most literal things we could possibly say. And when we live in this world, we spend ourselves to a certain extent. And so I'd like to look at that in terms of what Jesus could teach us about what it is to spend ourselves, what's worthy to be spent upon as we spend our lives. And the fact that we all are wearied by it. I get weary. I can't speak to anybody else's life, but I can tell you, if I get in a chair for very long, give me 5 minutes, I'm out. So there's a certain amount of weariness that has played into who I am now at this point in my journey, such that would happen. But I was reading, as I was preparing for this sermon, I saw this fascinating article, and it really expresses, in my mind, what it is to be spent. There was a guy who was in a blizzard, and everything he could manage to do, he finally made it back to a cabin. He was hunting, on a hunting expedition. He was by himself, had a dog with him, and he finally made it back to the cabin. But when he got there, he was so tired that he did not even consider taking the effort and energy to get a fire going. He just went to sleep. And it's just a cabin in the woods. There's no insulation. It's as cold inside as it is outside. And had the dog not awakened him, he would have just frozen to death because he was so spent that he couldn't even take care of his own needs. I think that's a worthy thing to consider as we look at this text. Jesus says in verse 22 of chapter 12 of Luke's Gospel, he said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you're going to eat, about your body, what you're going to wear. Life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. Consider the birds. They don't sow, they don't reap, they don't have storehouses or barns, and yet God feeds them. How much more valuable are you and I than the birds? Who of us, by worrying, could add 1 single hour to their life? Since we can't do this very little thing, why do we worry about the rest? Consider how the lilies grow, the flowers. They don't spin, they don't labor, and yet I tell you, not even Solomon was in all of his glory dressed like one of these. If that's how God takes care of the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow used to light a fire in the furnace, how much more will he clothe you and me, O we of little faith? Don't set our hearts on what we will eat and drink. Don't worry about any of that, for the pagan world runs after all these things. But your Father in heaven knows that you need them all. Seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Don't be afraid, little flock. Your Father has been pleased to give you and me the kingdom. Sell our possessions. Give to the poor. Provide purses for ourselves that will not wear out, and treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, where no thief will come and steal, and no moth will destroy. For wherever our treasure is, there our heart will be. Now, this is exactly the same kind of conversation Jesus has just finished having with us last week with regard to the fact of Nothing we really own is ours to own. I mean, everything we have is in some way. I remember talking to someone years ago about this, and they were pretty excited, exercised, upset would be the best term, and I didn't want to quite go that far, but they were upset about the fact that this person over here seemed to not be putting in the effort they thought necessary for them to have what they had. And I remember thinking to myself, anything we've got is because God has allowed. Think of how many of you remember going to Walmart and there was this little girl, a lady actually, I guess she was in her 30s, that was in a wheelchair. She was laying down in that chair. Her little body wasn't this long. And that was all she could do. But she was a greeter at Walmart. Now, God has granted for every person in this room throughout our lives up to this point, to this very day, that we can get up, we can walk around, we can drive, we can think, we can see, we can smell, we can eat food, take in nourishment, keep moving. And so from those gifts, we're able to have a job and generate an income that allows us to have the nicer things in life. Some of them. That means something. And that ties so well into this passage where Jesus is just saying, why worry about all these things? I'm a worrywart myself. I really am. I'm sorry about that. It's weird that I should be up here preaching, and yet I'm the worst worrier probably in this whole room. But I am. But I think about stuff like this, and I think to myself, you know, you and I, here are the kinds of worries that we have. Think about this for a moment. I can remember before Jackson came along, I remember explicitly it'd get to be lunchtime on a Saturday. And I'd look at Becky and I'd say, what do you want to do? She'd look at me and she'd say, I don't know, what do you want to do? Well, what we were trying to figure out was where we would like to go have lunch at a restaurant. And we were worried about it. That's where we were in life. And so this, I don't know what that says about me. I still think about that on a Saturday. Of course, with schoolwork, I've kind of got my work cut out for me. But even so, we can make choices. I go to my refrigerator, I open the doors. I don't think to myself that I'm going to look in there and see spider webs. I think I'm going to look in there and find something that I can eat. The pantry the same way. And so when Jesus says all of these things, seek first God's kingdom and all these things will be added, I don't know that he's necessarily talking about a bigger big screen TV. I think he's talking about the fact that there's food in the pantry and that we've got stuff to wear and the basic needs that we all have as human beings have been met. And they have. Here we sit. So we hear in this culture the other things. We hear that phrase very differently than in some cultures around the world where for them there is no pantry full of food. There is no refrigerator. And the house is not heated or cooled. I mean, I like the fact that I hear this noise behind me because I know this room is 75 degrees and comfortable and it's 80-something outside and muggy, but I'm not out there. I'm in here. I like that. I'm not one of those who would say, I don't want to go home to all the curtains in our house standing out because that's the only movement of air we can supply in our home. All the windows flung open with the bugs buzzing. And me sweating and thinking life is good. No, I like to go home and it's 75 degrees in our house and comfortable too. But we think about needs. We look at this list of things. God knows you have need of all these things, Jesus says to us, to all of us. And that word need has been retranslated for you and for me in this culture. Think about this. When we look at our vehicle, and we say, my car needs washing. Think what that sounds like in another culture where a car, anything that would transport one without having to put physical effort into the process of getting from here to there, would be like a miracle for them. But we think the car needs washing. We use that word, need, and we use it in ways that I don't know that that's really a need necessarily. Isn't it interesting that in this culture, and I'm not complaining, I don't want to live anywhere else. I don't know about you. But we use the word need in a very different way than a lot of people around the world would use that term. And it's funny too, because the word need, the more needs are satisfied, the more needs increase. There's more of them. I remember, see, I'm old enough to remember when I was in my home, there was a phone and it was hooked to the wall. And if I wasn't in the house when the phone rang, I wasn't home. And that meant the call would just not come in. Then I got an answering machine. I needed an answering machine. So I got an answering machine that answered the phone for me when I wasn't home, so I wouldn't miss a call, which when you work for yourself, that's pretty important. I'll never forget having this conversation with a friend of mine in Pennsylvania who was very anti-technology, like some of us are today. You know, I don't text, they'll say, or I don't use a cell phone, or I don't know how to access the voicemail. And I'm not saying those things are wrong, but this friend of mine, I don't want an answering machine. Well, he was starting his contracting business. It didn't take but 1 or 2 missed calls where it was money on the line. He went out and thought, an answering machine seems like a pretty good idea now to me. So these things of need are, every one of them, if you take any need we have, even the need for the common things like food in the pantry, food in our stomach, clothing, those needs are there because the cosmos is fallen. There was a time when there was no need. How much different would life be if there were no needs whatsoever? Can you imagine? No needs. Everything you need, I need, is just there. Just walk outside and there it is. Every bit of food, every bit of shelter. You don't need shelter, you don't need clothing, you don't need anything. Wow. Now, I need a cell phone. I didn't always need a cell phone, but I need a cell phone now. I mean, think about cultures around the world where they're still tribal and living in the bush. If you want to communicate with this tribe over here, you got to send somebody, and you hope they speak the same language. We don't have that problem anymore. Now Google will translate everything for us. If we want to communicate with somebody in Sri Lanka and we don't speak Hindustani, doesn't matter. Google will take care of that for you. What a place to live. But with all of these things that we say we need, there are dependencies now that we didn't have. How many of us think about or worry about the grid, the electrical grid? I do. I worry about it. I've got a friend that I talk to every Wednesday night on the way home from Manor, unless he's just not available. His job, they pay him a ton of money, more money than I'll ever see. They pay him a ton of money to take care of the electrical grid so that it's not hacked into by some foreign country or some hacker who just wants to take down the grid. That's his job. He's a cybersecurity specialist working for a company that does nothing but take care of the electrical grid on the eastern seaboard. That's all they do.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. But stop and consider. There are things that are outside his control. If Mr. Sun comes up one day and decides to emit a huge solar flare, that solar flare will travel all the way to the earth, and if it happens to come in this direction, then it can wipe out the grid no matter how hard my friend works. That's happened before. The telegraph system was burned out in the 1800s because of a solar flare. All the satellites could go down. You're driving somewhere and you're thinking, I don't know where I'm going. GPS is telling you, and all of a sudden it quits because a solar flare has taken out half the satellites. It can happen. Malcolm Muggeridge said it this way, he said, we've been made impotent by our strengths. Those are all strengths, but we're so dependent upon them now that if something happens and they go away, what are we going to do? I mean, my happy hunting ground is Kroger and Walmart. You guys, some of you guys in here would just go out and kill stuff and eat it. I can't do that. I'd be in a lot of trouble. So needs are very different for us in this culture. And need becomes something that drives a lot of the difficulties that we see in our culture right now. The fact that we need things, we say we need things, they become rights, right? Those things that we're thinking of as needs become things that we want somebody to supply to us as a right that we now have. And we start to look at these things that we see as needs, as rights, and when they don't come our way, then what do? We seek some kind of legal redress for somebody to do something about the fact that we no longer have this need being met as a right. Well, what does Jesus say to all this stuff? He says just what he said here. And I got to tell you, for me, this is a hard text because I do worry about all this stuff. I do. I worry about every bit of it. And I'm ashamed of that. I wish I did not. But Pascal says something very critical, and it's something I need to hear. Pascal was an 18th century mathematician who became a Christian very late in life. And he wrote something called the Pensées, which are literally just thoughts that he was having. And here's one of them. He says, reason, its last step is the recognition that there are an infinite number of things that are beyond our control. And it's merely feeble if we don't think hard enough to realize that. It's good to be tired, though, he says, after a vain and wearied search for the true good, such that we become so tired we finally stretch our arms out to the Redeemer. We finally reach out and say, God, I cannot live with this. You're going to have to do something for me. That's a good thing, Pascal was saying. I don't personally, we talked about it a little in Sunday school today, I don't personally want to go through something that brings me to the place where I am so broken that I'm forced by the circumstances to stretch my arms out and reach out to God in that way. But sometimes that's what has to happen because we're so self-sufficient we don't think about it. Faith doesn't contradict reason. But faith connects us with something different, a different fact. What is the fact? Faith connects us with the fact that we know Him. And in knowing Him, we have the recognition of just what Jesus has told us here today. That when we are spent, God knows that. When things come to us where it's just completely out of our control and we cannot do anything but reach our arms out toward the Redeemer, He reaches back. It's not something where we just have to accept things and resign ourselves to them. No, God is going to walk with us through those things. We're not going to walk by ourselves. And so when we find ourselves spent, completely spent, and there are life's elements that come at us that we just don't understand and we can't cope with them, we don't know what to do, I get there a lot myself. Then the question comes to us right out of this text. Do we really believe this or not? Do we believe that God is good? That He really cares about these things that we're suffering with? I mean, think about it. What Jesus' example. What's His example? The birds and the grass and the flowers. The birds and the grass and the flowers, they're not conscious of what's going on. They don't have the consciousness even to worry. And you know what's wonderful about worry? Well, it's actually not wonderful. It's wonderful not to. But what I think is remarkable about worry is that it adds a weight. Today we're going to all have things we're going to go through, right? I mean, something's going to happen. It might be just a minor inconvenience. Maybe the water comes out like our water came out rusty one day last week. We're all going to have, or we got a leak in a pipe. That was a big deal. I came home from work and had to fix a pipe. We're all going to face those things, but if I'm spending my time today worrying about something that may happen tomorrow, I've added a weight to today that I really don't have to carry. Who of us can add, Jesus asks, one bit of time to our lives by worrying? Think about the birds, the stars, the grass, the whole earth. None of that stuff knows that there's a God in heaven who really cares about it, but we do. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, speak with me, I'll stay here.